Lecture. This is 7.5, World War I, Military and Diplomacy. Our theme here is America in the World. This is the first of two lectures on World War I. So today we're looking at what it was like in terms of diplomacy and military, obviously. And then the next one we'll talk more about what it was like in the United States on the home front. So our learning objective is explain the causes and consequences of U.S. involvement in World War I. And we're going to start with our entry into the war. After initial neutrality in World War I, the nation entered the conflict, departing from the U.S. foreign policy tradition of non-involvement in European affairs. So that's tradition of non-involvement, going back to Washington's farewell address, is where we're getting that. At the same time, we have a pretty recent history of involvement in outside world affairs. As you remember, we just fought the Spanish-American War not more than 20 years before our entry into World War I. So the reasons why we entered was Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare was starting to interfere with American commerce. The United States was trying to trade with all of the belligerent countries, so that included the United Kingdom and Germany. But the German submarines, or U-boats, as you see in the picture here, were starting to practice unrestricted submarine warfare. They were shooting down or torpedoing any ship, whether it was commercial or merchant, or it was passenger or military ship, naval ship, without warning. And when American lives were lost aboard the Lusitania, which was a British passenger ship, the United States got really angry. They went to Germany and said that you need to stop this because otherwise the United States is going to cut off diplomatic relations with Germany, which would be the first step into going into war. Germany, not wanting to make the United States angry and have another country to fight in World War I, said, all right, we'll stop. But it continues to happen until a ship called the Sussex ends up being shot down by a German U-boat. At that point, Germany makes their promise a little bit more formal with the Sussex Pledge. At the same time, Germans are trying to keep the United States from entering into the war, and then also strategizing about what they could do in the event that the United States does enter into the war on the side of the Allied powers. And that's where we get to the Zimmermann telegram. It was a note from the German ambassador to Mexico saying that if Mexico attacked the United States, that Germany would help Mexico regain the lost territory that they lost in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo back in 1845. So Mexico wasn't really interested, but the fact that Germany was trying to provoke another country to attack the United States did not sit well with the United States. Up until the United States enters the war, there was a mixture of policy and sentiment at home. So there's a preparedness movement that we are increasing military production in the event that we do have to go into war, right? If we go into war and we don't have our Navy built up or we're not ready to go into war, then that might be really bad for us. Wilson runs on the campaign in 1916. He kept us out of war, basically saying that Wilson should be reelected because he kept the peace at home. Ironically, before or shortly after his second inauguration, he is asking for, Germany had gone back on the Sussex Pledge and started shooting American ships down. And so by April, the United States is going into war. All right, so the nation entered the conflict in response to Woodrow Wilson's call for the defense of humanitarian and democratic principles. So you see the picture there of Wilson asking for this declaration of war in Congress. And he frames this in a moral way. He says that the submarine attacks were attacking democracy as a whole. He said that it was warfare against mankind, and the world must be made safe for democracy. At the same time that the United States is approving their declaration for war, the Bolshevik Revolution is beginning in Russia, which is going to cost the Russians to exit the war. You can see on the map on the right side that Germany signs a treaty with Russia. It's called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and Russia gives up a lot of territory that is now present-day Ukraine in order to leave the war. Now Germany has the ability to focus all of their resources on the western front of the war near France and Belgium. You see the maps on the bottom of where France is. On the western front, the war had been pretty much stalemated because of trench warfare. You see an aerial photograph of what those trenches looked like. And so now that Germany was able to focus more resources on that front, the fear was that they would be able to push through that trench warfare and occupy Paris, leading to a German victory. So the United States enters the war, and the American Expeditionary Forces, although they play a limited role in combat, the U.S. entry helps to tip the balance of the conflict in favor of the Allies. So the American Expeditionary Forces, or the AEF, are led by General John J. Pershing. At first, their task is to plug up the little holes along the Western Front to keep Germany from finding a weak spot and getting through. And then eventually, they're responsible for an entire section of the Western Front, and the Americans are responsible for repelling the last offensive by the Germans at the Second Battle of the Marne. You see in the picture on the bottom left, the areas that are shaded and crosshatched are where the German offensive happened and how they were repelled, and then also how close they were to actually getting to Paris. The one note for the AEF, you see that they still had segregation within the units. So that hasn't changed, and it's a little bit of an uncomfortable topic for the United States because supposedly they're fighting for equality and they're fighting for these moral causes, yet at the same time they are practicing segregation within their own troops. And finally, on November 11th in 1918, the armistice is signed, and the United States, because of the limited amount of time that they spent fighting the war, they had fewer troops die in casualty and more troops die of disease. So this is where the Spanish flu comes in. So the Spanish flu was what is called a global pandemic. So I know this is probably new for most of you, but it was a virus that was easily transmitted, and it reached all the different parts of the world, and it killed a lot of people. And that was the last time that a global pandemic ever happened until the year 2020. And that's why we are doing lectures on YouTube this year. So the Treaty of Versailles is the ultimate peace treaty. At the end of the war, Wilson was deeply involved in the post-war negotiations for war, and he goes in with the other members of the Big Four. So this is George Clemenceau, Lloyd George, Vittorio Orlando, and these are all coming from France, the UK, and Italy. They're the ones that are driving the negotiations. Wilson goes in there with a very idealistic agenda. He calls it his 14 points, and he wants things like freedom of the sea. So he doesn't want more submarines threatening commerce. He wants arms reduction, so trying to put a cap on the militarism that had led to the war in the first place. He wants self-determination for parts of Europe that had been conquered by Germany. And again, this is a little bit dicey for the United States because they had been an imperial power, and countries like the Philippines wanted that same level of self-determination, but we continued to occupy those areas. He wanted to end the secret treaties that also led to World War I. And then finally, his most important point, he wanted to create a League of Nations. So this would be a multinational organization that would be responsible for arbitrating international disagreements and keeping the peace. In the actual negotiations, most of the points are ignored. There is some degree of self-determination in Europe that's adopted. The League of Nations is approved, and there's a clause on collective security basically saying that if one of the members of the League is attacked, then the other members will come to the defense of that country. And that's going to be a sticking point for Americans in the ratification, which we'll talk about. But despite those points of the 14 points being accepted into the Treaty of Versailles, The rest of the negotiations were really vindictive and were trying to take revenge on Germany for all of the destruction that they supposedly caused, according to especially the French. They blamed the entire war on Germany. So the articles that are meant to punish Germany are basically forcing Germany to pay reparations. And because Germany doesn't have enough money to pay for them, they're paying for these reparations with their industrial supplies. You see the picture in the bottom right. They're shipping all the industrial supplies to the countries to which they're paying reparations. Well, this is going to limit Germany's ability to be able to build its economy back up. It's going to lead to a longer period of economic instability, which will be the environment that will be ripe for a leader like Hitler to exploit and rise to power. All right, so back at home, the United States refuses to ratify the Treaty of Versailles or join the League of Nations. The Republicans were angered by the lack of input in negotiations. Remember, Wilson was a Democrat. He was the first Democrat that was elected since Grover Cleveland, and then before Grover Cleveland, there hadn't been a Democrat that was elected since before the Civil War. Woodrow Wilson's also the first Democrat from the South to be elected since the Civil War. The Republicans were split up into two different factions. They were the Irreconcilables and the Reservationists. Based on the name, you can tell that the Irreconcilables did not feel that anything could be changed within the treaty or the peace agreement to where they would vote in favor of it. The Reservationists, which were led by Henry Cabot Lodge, thought that if the article of the League of Nations was taken out, or that article or that clause that would cause the United States to go to war if another member of the League of Nations was attacked, could be taken out, then they would be in favor of the treaty. Wilson did not want to budge, so he's going to try and build national support and then have the American people pressure their representatives and senators to vote in favor of it. While he's on his speaking tour, he collapses, suffers a stroke, and then leaves him severely limited for the rest of his term. The Senate will ultimately reject the Treaty of Versailles and reject the League of Nations, and the United States won't have a formal peace with Germany until after Wilson leaves office in 1921. All right, so here is our recap. So the U.S. enters the war to make the world safe for democracy. The American Expeditionary Forces made the differences in the fighting, despite Germany looking to focus its efforts on the Western Front. And Wilson had high hopes for the Treaty of Versailles, but the negotiations went poorly, and the United States Senate rejected the treaty. So this is it for this lecture on World War I. Like I said, the next lecture we will also be talking about World War I, but more so about what it was like for Americans at home during the war period. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you on the next one.